Bonsoir. Je voudrais remercier Ange Bocaire pour l'invitation de parler aujourd'hui ici. Malheureusement, je vais parler en anglais parce que mon français, c'est pas si bon. Et aussi, la présentation va être enregistrée. Je vois que je ne veux pas que mon français soit enregistré pour l'éternité. Mais vous pouvez poser des questions ou faire des commentaires à la fin en français. J'essaierai de les répondre. Je vais parler de l'archéologie du colonialisme contemporain en Afrique. Et je vais parler surtout de la matérialité du colonialisme. Et d'un point de vue archéologique, mais pas seulement archéologique, ça veut dire je parlerai de la matérialité du colonialisme en général. Et il y a des éléments qu'on peut peut-être considérer plutôt de la géographie ou de l'histoire de l'art. Mais même ces éléments, on peut les considérer aussi de l'archéologie parce que l'archéologie, c'est la science de la culture matérielle. Je vais parler de mes projets, des matériaux que j'ai trouvés pendant mes travaux, ma recherche en Afrique, en Éthiopie, la Guinée équatoriale et le Somaliland, mais je parlerai aussi d'autres régions, d'autres pays. So the first question that we can ask ourselves when we do contemporary archaeology and the contemporary archaeology of Africa in particular is, so what do we need an archaeology, a contemporary archaeology of colonialism in Africa or elsewhere? Because contemporary colonialism or the archaeology of the colonialism of the 19th and the 20th century is of course very well known through very different sources. We have recent historical sources, we have oral testimonies, we even have films, we have novels, we have photographs, etc. So what can archaeology really do for us, for understanding better the archaeology of colonialism or imperialism, actually the second wave of European colonialism? So there are several things that archaeology can do, as any other contemporary archaeology. But I think that in the case of Africa, in the context of colonialism, I think that archaeology can be particularly useful because sometimes the information that we have about the 20th century in Africa is not so plentiful as the information we have for Europe or the United States. And this is especially the case when we talk about the peripheries of the colonial territory. So this is one of the things that we can do. We can explore the margins, the peripheries of the colonies, these aspects that do not have left a strong trace in the documentary record. We can also, and that's perhaps the main thing, we can study the materiality of colonialism, and especially the material logic of colonialism, because sometimes historians, anthropologists, the students of culture and sociology, they, in my view, they tend to portray modern colonialism too much as something immaterial, something that has a lot to do with fantasies, with the discursive, with ideologies. But the truth is that colonialism in the 19th and the 20th century, as well as in the first century AD, was and still is in some places a very material phenomenon that we cannot understand if we don't understand the materiality of it. And when I talk about the materiality of colonialism, I refer to the infrastructures of colonialism, like the railways or the roads, the airports, the cities, the mines, and so on. I am referring also to the monuments, to the symbolic construction of colonial landscapes, which was also a very material construction of these landscapes. We can also study the participation of the colonized territories in the big events of the late 19th and the 20th century. Perhaps the most important events in which the colonies took part were the two world wars. And of course, we know that there were lots of colonial troops fighting for the different armies in the First World War and the Second World War. The role of these colonial armies is still not so well known compared to the national armies, but it's better known that the actual development of these world wars in the colonized territories. Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, Sudan, Ethiopia, they were all important scenarios of the two world wars. And sometimes we can find very intriguing stories in these places that have not transcended much. This doesn't mean that we can only approach these events from the point of view of material culture, but the archaeological record, the ruins of war, the traces of these events is a very eloquent testimony of the way in which colonialists actually acted, actually worked in the ground during the late 19th and 20th centuries. We can, of course, study the crimes of colonialism. And we have to bear in mind that colonialism was tried to portray itself as something very progressive, the mission civilisatrice. So the idea was that the colonial powers were actually trying to develop the countries that they were, in fact, exploiting. And the exploitative side of colonialism was, of course, concealed or underplayed. And many of the colonial violence was never really known outside the countries, outside the regions where it happened. And archaeology is now providing evidence, providing material evidence of these crimes. And I'm going to talk about one specific example that I had the opportunity to study. We can, of course, also study the daily life of the colonizers and the colonized through the material remains that they left behind. And this is again interesting because there is a lot of literature about the daily life in the colonies, but this was basically, it was very much romanticized, it was very much idealized, and then many social actors actually do not appear in the memories, the writings of the people that participated in the colonial experiment. And I'm referring to the servants, the workers in the plantations, in colonial plantations or mines and so on. But archaeology provides evidence about all these lives that do not appear or that appear in a very biased way in the written record. And finally, archaeology can also be an opportunity to approach other colonialists and other Western diasporas in Africa and in other colonial spaces that are not that well known. That's the case with the Greeks in the Horn of Africa or the Turco-Egyptian Empire. So I'm going to select a few themes that I find particularly interesting and about which I have done some research. The first is the construction of the colonial space. This is going to take about 40% of my time. And the different spaces in particular where the colony was constructed, the urban space or the domestic space in general, the space of the dead, the territory, the wider landscape, and the margins of the colonies, the borderlands. Then I will talk about the everyday life, the other colonialisms, and colonial violence. So let's start with the construction of colonial space, and we can start with towns and cities. Urbanism was not unknown in Africa before the 19th century, before the expansion of the European powers in sub-Saharan Africa. In some places, it had a very long experience, such as in the Swahili coast, for instance, or in the Sudan, or in some places of North Ethiopia. In others, however, like in North Central Africa, it was something new. And this experience, this previous urban experience in Africa, determined in a way the urbanization, the process of colonial urbanization. But there are some things that did not change much, independently of the perspective of whether there was a previous urban experience in the colonized country or not. And this is the fact that cities and, in general, settlements were machines for segregation, for racial segregation and class segregation. And this is something that we can see very clearly in the maps of the different cities, of the different colonial cities. This was a very widespread phenomenon. It was these cities and towns as segregation machines existed in the Portuguese colonies, in Spanish colonies, French colonies, British colonies, and so on. But if we look at fascist colonialism, we can see the working of these artifacts that were cities in a much more evident way, because one of the advantages of fascism is that it's very brutal. It doesn't try to conceal much the way it works. So both the literature, what the fascists were writing, and the materialization of their ideas is very obvious. It's very evident, very direct, very explicit. And it's useful to look at fascist colonialist, fascist spaces, because they allow us to then reinterpret all the colonial spaces. Because at the end of the day, all colonialism or modern colonialism is essentially fascist in the sense that it's based on violence and racial categories. This is the map of Asmara, which was the capital of the Italian colony of Eritrea. And we can see that there are different spaces in this town. We can see that there is a very disciplined, very organized space to the right, and a more chaotic space to the left and in the lower part of the city to the south. And this is, of course, showing the areas that were used by the Europeans and the areas that were used by the colonizers, by the local people, the natives. And this is not a coincidence. The fact that the European space is always much better organized, much better ordered, is because this was actually the kind of message that the colonial powers were trying to transmit, that they were trying to show to the people, to the colonized, that there was an orderly space that was the space of the colonizers, and that there was the space of the savages, the space of the colonized. So the main preoccupation with the colonizers was to have the colonized in specific spaces that could be more or less easily surveyed. Architecture was, of course, very important in transmitting these colonial ideologies, these colonial categories. And the case of Asmara, again, it's a very beautiful example because it was mostly built during the 1920s and 1930s, during the period of the fascist occupation, although Asmara was founded in the late 19th century. But most of the architecture is from Mussolini's period, so it's very overtly fascist. One of the things that Africa gave the Italians was the opportunity to develop the fascist plans ex novo from scratch, because in Italy, of course, cities had a very long history. The built space was very dense and it could not be easily destroyed and reconstructed. But in Africa, they could build new towns entirely. So this is what they did in the case of Asmara. And they constructed these buildings. And Asmara actually was an experiment in modernism. Italian architecture during the 1920s and 1930s was very progressive. They were developing this rationalist architecture, which was an avant-garde architecture, perhaps the most advanced architecture of the time, with the Bauhaus also. And they used the colonies as a space of experimentation to develop these models, these new models of architecture. And this was useful also because this gave them the opportunity of showing that they were actually very modern and very progressive, and that they were bringing civilization to Africa. But at the same time that they were producing these very modernist buildings, they were all the time making citations to the classical past, to the Roman Empire, in a very obvious way, like this cinema empire. There are elements in the architecture that actually cite Roman architecture in a more obvious way. Here, this is another cinema. This is called Rome, and you can see the pilasters, the Roman pilasters. But at the same time, it's a very modernist building. So it's not a historicist building. It's very rationalist and modern. And it's very interesting that the Italians were investing a lot in cinemas, which were basically spaces for the white population, so they were not intended for the Africans. But cinemas were at the time one of the most powerful symbols of progress, and they were actually bringing progress. They were bringing social and cultural change, because people were seeing in cinemas things that they could not have imagined, and it was actually changing the mentality of the people. So there's a mixture then here of an architecture and a space that are strongly related to the idea of modernity. Some of the buildings in Asmara are really marvels, amazing examples of modernist architecture of the 1920s and 1930s. But there is a problem with that. These buildings are too beautiful, some of them. They are really marvels of art. And we can have the wrong impression that this is what colonialism was about. And actually, when one reads about colonial architecture in Africa or elsewhere, or in Southeast Asia, one can have the impression that this is what colonialism was about. It was about building these architectural dreams in countries with no previous architectural tradition or cities and so on. And this, on the one hand, is stealing the history of these countries, which have their own vernacular architecture. And on the other hand, it's providing a false image of what colonialism was about. This was the architecture for the elite, of course. It was just for the white people. It was not for the local people, which were started in shantytowns, right? Some of the most amazing architectural experiences or experiments in colonial East Africa were never developed. They were fantasies that were meant to be constructed at some point. But Ethiopia in particular was a colony, an Italian colony for a very short period between 1936 and 1941, and most of the plans were never came to fruition. We have some examples of fascist architecture, but not that much. So on the one hand, we have the architecture, we have the style of the buildings, we have also the organization of the built space, but there is also a temporal dimension, a historical dimension of these cities. As I was saying, in many African cities, in many African countries, there was a previous urban tradition, a historical tradition of building cities that went 1,000 years or more back in time. And that was more or less the case of Ethiopia. I say more or less because it's not actually what we have in Ethiopia. After the fall of the Aksumite kingdom in the 9th century AD, there are not proper big cities until the late 19th century. But there were places of permanent settlement with monumental buildings, and one of them was Gondar, which was the capital of the Ethiopian Empire in the 17th and 18th century. So what the Italians did when they arrived to Gondar, when they conquered this place, they restored the buildings, the old Ethiopian buildings, the castles and palaces from the 17th century and the 18th century. And then they linked these buildings, which were supposed to showcase the past of Ethiopia. They linked these buildings with the new fascist city, with the new fascist buildings, through a monumental avenue. And at the end of this avenue, we had the main buildings of fascist power, like the city council, the house of the Casa del Fascio, the house of the fascists, the post office, and so on, made in a very modernist, very rationalist style. So they were linking the past and the present. They were trying to portray the legitimacy of the Italians, of the new rulers, and they were linking themselves with the past of Ethiopia that was portrayed as something actually from the past, as a ruin, as heritage. In other places that had some previous urban tradition, sometimes colonial powers, European colonial powers, appropriated these architectural traditions, and this is something that can be seen very well in the case of the Swahili coast in Kenya and Tanzania. The colonial powers, both the Germans and the British, they replicated the buildings, the style of the Swahili houses and also of the previous Omani colonialists that preceded the European colonialists, as in this case, this is a customs house in Pangani. But we don't have to go to really important places and big towns to see this appropriation of the past, of the urban past, of the civilized past by the European colonizers. I have recently excavated a palace from the late 19th century that was the seat of power of a local sheikh in the borderland between Sudan and Ethiopia. His name was Abu Shok, and he was an independent ruler. I mean, this was like an independent chiefdom for about 200 years in between Sudan and Ethiopia. And when the Italians arrived to this place, the first thing they did was to establish their command posts in this palace. So you have to think that in most African regions, the mass of the population were illiterate, and making these symbolic gestures through material culture, through the manipulation of the built space, was a very powerful and a very easy way of transmitting the ideological message of the colonies. We are the new rulers, we are occupying the space of the previous rulers, and we are occupying these prominent positions, because most of these places, as happens in the case of Ethiopia, are very prominent in the landscape. They are very conspicuous, very visible. So the different colonial powers were based on different ideological bases. So it's obviously not the same the case of fascist Italy and the case of Britain or Portugal or Spain. Portugal and Spain were very traditional empires. And in both cases, they were very traditional in their ideologies, they were very conservative, and they also were very old empires. They both had large empires since the late 15th century. So what we find in both cases in the built environment of these colonialists is a continuous citation of this glorious past. So in both cases, both Spain and Portugal, during the time of the second wave of European colonialism, they were rather like third world countries. I mean, Spain and Portugal were very undeveloped in the late 19th century, but they had these, especially in the case of Portugal, these large colonial empires that they had inherited from their moment of glory in the 16th and the 17th century. So in the case of Spain, the country had lost most of its colonial territories during the early part of the 19th century. By the late 19th century, during the Age of Empire, they just have a few territories like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and in Africa, a patch of desert, the Western Sahara, which had basically nothing, and a very tiny territory in Central Africa, Equatorial Guinea, which is smaller than Belgium. Belgium has like 30,000 square kilometers, and Equatorial Guinea has 20,000 square kilometers. So that was the African empire for the Spaniards. So they tried to make out for this really very small empire with a very monumental architecture, which all the time cited this glorious past. So you can see this is the Cathedral of Bata, the capital of the mainland of the continental part of Equatorial Guinea. And it's a copy of the colonial churches of Latin America in the 17th and the 18th century. The Italians, before the fascist period, they were also very traditional. They were very Catholic, conservative, paternalistic, and so on. And the buildings that they built, especially in Somalia, were very traditional too. They were very historicist, representing, reusing the Gothic style, like in the Cathedral of Mogadishu. But then the things changed, as we have seen, and rationalism became the main thing. So it's not just the style of these buildings, but the place that these buildings occupy. In Portuguese and Spanish colonies, the main building is the cathedral or a big church. So this is the main element in any built environment. During the fascist period, in the case of the Italian colonies, it's the Casa del Fascio, the fascist house. This is the fascist house in Eritrea. As you can see, again, a very modernist building. and this is a fascist house in Tripolitania in Libya. Now, in the case of the longest-lived colonial empires, we can see in the material culture some ideological changes that are very interesting. And this is the case particularly with the Portuguese colonies. So in Angola, for instance, the Portuguese have been there since the 16th century, and they left only in 1974. So during this very long period, of course, the ideology of the Portuguese state changed. And the changes that we can see during the 20th century have to do with the role that the colonies play in the Portuguese worldview. So like in the case of Spain, and to a certain extent France, the colonies stopped being regarded as colonies, and they started being regarded as provinces, as part of the country, of the nation. And this is something that happens in Spain and Portugal from the 1940s onward, which is precisely in the moment when decolonization starts. It was a way for these colonial powers to try to cling to these colonies that were going to get independence at some point or the other. So in the case of the Portuguese colonies, we see that there is a rush to build modernist buildings. So instead of these historicist buildings that we had for the last 50 or 60 years, we have these new churches that are so modern, right? They're very good examples of modernist architecture. So the idea, in a sense, conscious or unconsciously, they were trying to prove the world that they were not they were not just depredating the colonies, they were not exploiting the colonies, but they were developing the colonies. They were progressive and modern colonial powers. So it was a way of trying to show that they had the right to remain in these places, which of course was useless. Now, I have been emphasizing the differences, the material differences between different colonies, but there are some elements that are shared, some architectural elements that are shared through most colonies, and a very good example is the veranda. The veranda is this porch that surrounds a colonial house, and this is actually a very typical example of how the colonial imagination works, because everybody when anybody sees a veranda, immediately identifies it with colonial fantasies, with colonial films like Memories from Africa or something like that. The architectural element itself thus did not originate in Africa. It comes from India, and the name actually is from an Indian language. But it was incorporated into African architecture relatively early during the colonial period, and it was extremely successful. And we can think that it is well adapted to a tropical environment, which is true. But I think that there is something else than just mere adaptation to the climate or to the geography of a tropical environment. And I think that the veranda is actually a spatial interface between the colonizers and the colonized. Because what the veranda is providing is a space that is in between the public and the private. So it is not entirely private in the way that you can see people sitting in the veranda, right? So it's not like the inside of the house that is completely off limits for the native people, from the people outside the house. But at the same time, it's not a public space, so it's not a space that everybody can use. And it's a protected space. It's a place where the colonizers can sit and watch the colonial spectacle. They can see the indigenous people going back and forth, and they can look at them, as I say, from a space that is safe, because it is very well delimited. It has the protection of the fence, and it's elevated. So when you're sitting in the veranda, you have the impression that you are above these people that you're looking in the street, and the people that are in the street are looking at you from a position of inferiority, from a spatial point of view. So that's a subtle way, I think, and a very unconscious way of assimilating these colonial categories of the role of the different people in the colony. And then there is another aspect that I think it should be explored more in depth, which is the material texture of colonialism, the material texture of houses. And this is a very archaeological thing to which probably historians and anthropologists don't pay that much attention, which is, I'm referring here to the building materials of these structures, of the colonial buildings. So there are differences here in the kind of materials that the different colonial powers are using. So for the British, it's basically bricks. For the Spaniards, it's as much as they can use it. It's a stone, because stone and the Spanish ideology of the colonial period was linked to the idea of glory and empire and so on of the 16th century and the 17th century. In the case of the Italian, it is these very homogeneous surfaces that you could see in the buildings of Asmara. So it is these very white, very homogeneous surfaces that are, on the one hand, very modernist. This homogeneous surface is one of the trademarks of modernism, but at the same time, it's also very Mediterranean. So these materials are national, and they are, in all cases, they are transmitting something about ideas of power and civilization. For the British, the bricks are a symbol of civilization. You can imagine being like this British colonial house. It's in Gambela, which is just in the limit between Sudan and South Sudan and Ethiopia. It's a very remote place. And of course, in many, many kilometers, the only thing that you can see are huts made of straw and wood. And then you arrive to Gambela and you see these brick buildings that are not that different from the buildings in your own hometown in England. So this is creating an idea of civilization for the local people, but it's also creating a sense of domesticity, of being at home in very faraway places. So colonial space was key in producing and reproducing the values and the categories and the hierarchies, especially the racial hierarchies of colonial ideology, but it was not the only space where this was taking place. Equally important was the space of the dead, and this is something that, of course, it's not very original. This is something that happens in the 20th century, as it happened 2,500 years before in Athens or in the Near East. So cemeteries are a very interesting space that can be explored from the point of view of social archaeology, to explore the making of the fabric of these colonial communities. Of course, the white colonial communities. And you have to bear in mind that, especially in the case of small towns and colonial outposts, we don't have a lot of information about the people that were living there at a certain moment of time. But we have the tombs, so we can study the epigraphy as if this was a Roman settlement or a Greek settlement. And of course, the people that we find in these cemeteries are the kind of people that we can expect. So basically, civil servants, soldiers, missionaries, and mostly men, because colonialism is a male affair, and this explains a lot about the way it was carried out and it was materialized. These ideas of conquest and violence and so on that are inherent to the colonial idea. This is from a very beautiful Protestant cemetery in the island of Corisco that was established in the mid-19th century and lasted for only 20 years or so. And the slabs are very elaborate. They were produced in the United States and shipped all the way to Central Africa. There is another thing about the archaeology of colonialism, which is that we don't have just necessarily to study the colonial period, but also the colonial period in the present, the memory of the colonial period in the present. And this is something that is not that well known. So the fate of many of these cemeteries tells a lot about the colonial experience and what happened with these empires and this colonial ideology. So this is what remains of the tomb of Lieutenant Colonel William Gattaker, which was a very, very important military man of the Victorian period. So it was an example of a colonial hero, and so that's his tomb today. It's the colonial cemetery is now basically a rubbish dump. So people go there to throw rubbish and do their stuff. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor of, European colonialism in Africa. It's another example of another forgotten colonial cemetery with military tombs, in this case in the very tiny island of Elobey Chico in Equatorial Guinea. Another thing that it becomes very obvious when one looks at colonial cemeteries is the multinational, multicultural, and multi-religious nature of these colonies. So when we think about colonialism, we tend to think French colonialists, everybody was French; Spanish colonialists, everybody was Spanish, and so on. But the fact is that there were people from basically everywhere in every colony, especially during the early years of the colonial period. This is again from the cemetery of Elobey Chico, and this is a very interesting case because we have two cemeteries here in the same island. The island is really tiny; it has only 20 hectares. It's really small, but it has a large cemetery with two parts that are clearly divided. And one is the colonial cemetery, the Protestant cemetery, and the other one is the Catholic cemetery. And you can see how the Protestants and the Catholics were using different kinds of material culture. So it is not like the Europeans were just a homogeneous bloc that were imposing themselves over equally homogeneous African population. There were obviously differences that were played out through material culture. And you can see how this is the tomb of a German merchant, and he's using this stylish Gothic lettering. And perhaps more interesting, the Protestant cemetery had a morgue. So it had a place for processing the corpses. And this is related to Protestant and modern ideas of hygiene and dealing with corpses and so on. So there was nothing like that in the Catholic cemetery. There were Frankmasons, and again that's interesting because this was a Spanish colony. You wouldn't see the tomb of a Frankmason in Spain in the late 19th century. That would be unthinkable, but you can do it. You could do it in a colony. And there were also people that were not Europeans or Christians. And in the case of Africa, there was and still is a huge Lebanese diaspora, mostly merchants, mostly in West and Central Africa. And they had their own ways of burying themselves. And again, they use a particular kind of material culture. That's the grave of a Muslim merchant from Syria, in this case. And the style of the tomb is very different from the others, and of course it's oriented to Mecca. And in the same cemetery you can see burials of Greek citizens, Italians, and so on. So in the colonial cemetery you can see how the social hierarchy is played out. You can see, of course, monumental burials, more modest burials and graves. Because although basically the idea was that there was a white elite and an inferior class, which were the Africans. In fact, there were differences, of course, within the white settler society, and these were again materialized in the tombs. And then there was the case, the racial hierarchies, as in the city. So basically, when we talk about colonial cemeteries, it's basically the cemeteries of the white people. You don't see any African name in any of these cemeteries. They could have been buried there because in the case of these islands, I was mentioning in Equatorial Guinea, there was a large local Protestant population, but they were not being buried with the white Protestants. A very nice example of the racial hierarchies, how people were not just expelled from the space of the dead that was reserved for the white people, but also conceptualized in a different way. Is this monument again in this British outpost in Gambela? It was a monument that was erected in 1941. And it was commemorating the dead of the Belgian army during the conquest, during the Abyssinian campaign of 1941. It's a rather humble monument. It's just made of concrete, and it has this plaque. It says, of course, to the memory of the soldiers and non-commissioned officers, the porters of the Belgian colonial troops that died during the Abyssinian campaign. And one of the things that struck me is that the number of porters is way higher than the number of soldiers that died, which is amazing because they were not shooting. So they died of exhaustion and disease. So this means that, as we know, these colonial porters were still being dealt with basically as slaves in 1941. So the other thing is that we have this monument to the memory of these soldiers and porters, but they are anonymous. They are just a number. Of 400 people that died for Belgium. But then in the same cemetery, we have two individualized burials, two individualized graves, and they are dedicated to the memory of two white officers, two Belgian officers that died during the combats, Lieutenant Lambrecht and Lieutenant Simone. And so this was probably an unconscious way of materializing the differences, the racial differences in the colonial society. So you have white people that have the right to a name and the right to be individual subjects, and then you have the masses of the colonized people who were just numbers, and in the worst case, could be just cannon fodder for the colonial wars. That's, of course, a Belgian case, but it was the same with the British, the French, the Italians, or the Spaniards. And you can see here again the fate of these colonial cemeteries, how the cemetery was transformed into a dump. So these colonial heroes doesn't mean anything to the people now living in the area. So most of the cemeteries that we have, they were for the white elite, and they were conceived as, again, as showcases of colonial ideology, of the superiority of the white people. There are not that many cases of cemeteries for the white working classes, basically because there were not that many. The idea was that the colonizers were there to have Africans as servants, as workers, so that the whites didn't have to do the work. But there is this example from Ethiopia that no longer exists because it was destroyed by a road a few years ago. This is a monument, this is a cemetery for workers that died building roads in Ethiopia. They probably died in accidents during the construction of the roads. And you can see that it's a modest colonial cemetery with a concrete altar and very simple gravestones that say, well, here died this guy who was a worker. So the colonial space, the colonial landscape was not just constructed in cemeteries and cities, but also in the entire colonial territory. And again, fascist colonialism is great to see how this landscape was built because, again, it was very explicit and very brutal, not very subtle. These are Italian monuments that were built during the fascist occupation of Ethiopia, ahead of Mussolini, and a Roman imperial eagle, and this one is in Eritrea. Most of them disappeared. They were destroyed from 1941 onwards. But there is at least one wonderful example in a very remote and isolated place of Ethiopia, near the Lake Tana in north-central Ethiopia. And it's a representation of the fasces, the Italian, the Roman, originally Roman symbol of the axe that were carried by the lictors. And it has the inscription, it has a drawing and an engraving of the Capitoline Wolf and the words Roma imperat, like Rome commands. So as you can see, it's not very subtle, right? So the idea is that the entire colony was going to have these kind of monuments everywhere, and they built a lot, and not just in prominent places, in big towns and so on, but also in very small places. So the idea was to physically occupy the country with these small monuments. And I found one of them by chance when doing a survey in West Ethiopia, again in a very remote place. And this one had been destroyed immediately after the Second World War, but you could still see the stairs. And it was dedicated to the memory of Vittorio Bottego, which was an Italian explorer of the late 19th century that was killed exactly in the same spot. And it is very interesting because we interviewed the locals, and they gave us their story about why this person was killed. So there was the fascist story and the colonial story about Vittorio Bottego being a hero and being killed treacherously by the locals and so on. And the local story was completely different. They didn't know anything about the Italian story, so it had not reached them. And they had their own interpretation of the place. And basically for them, the problem with Vittorio Bottego is that the locals had tried to be hospitable with Vittorio Bottego. They had tried to give him cows and sheep and hens and chicken and so on. And he refused all the time. So they became very angry and they decided to attack him, and they killed him and everybody in his group. So these monuments sometimes are also an occasion, or the ruins of these monuments are an occasion to study other visions, other perspectives of history. And they are sort of aide-mémoire for the local people. So it's a way of anchoring the memory of these events, but also to reinterpret these events. In the case of traditional colonial powers like Portugal and Spain, again, it was basically churches and religious buildings that were the main monuments in the landscape, crosses, virgins, statues of saints, and so on. So this was a way of inscribing the landscape with the ideology and the material presence of the colonizers. And this is the church, the mission of Corisco. And for me, it's a wonderful example of what the Spanish colonialism was about in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And it's a good example of what archaeology can do by looking at material culture. So if you look at this building, it looks really very impressive, right? It's like a huge building. It reminds of the big monasteries and missions of the imperial period in Spain in the 16th century and the 17th century. But it's just a facade. So when you see the map of the building, it's just a very small space. It's not functional. So the idea was just to impress the people, not just the local people, but also to impress. This was just in front of the beach. So everybody that came from Cameroon to Gabon, that passed near Corisco, they had to see this huge church, this huge symbol of civilization and Christianity. But it was just like these Western scenarios, right? That these houses that don't have anything behind. So it was something like that with this church. It was very spectacular, but it was completely hollow. And this is, I think, a good metaphor of what Spanish colonialism was: spectacular but hollow. So the colonial landscape the colonization produced important changes in the landscape, not just in terms of the things that were being built, but also in terms of the things that were being destroyed. The exploitation of the countryside often meant the resettlement of large masses of population. Sometimes the voluntary resettlement of people that were coming closer to centers of colonial power or of colonial economy, like roads, factories, mines, and so on. And this is something that can be approached archaeologically. This is the case, for example, with the work of François Richard in Senegal, in the Sine region. He has been studying the evolution of the settlement pattern in the area from the 16th century, from the age of the Atlantic trade in the pre-colonial period, to the mid-20th century, and you can see how during the period of the colony there is a massive reorganization of the landscape with lots of small villages and also sacred spaces being abandoned and new spaces being built, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes forcibly. From the 1920s onwards, there are very clear attempts at reorganizing the landscape, at planning the landscape to make it more productive. And some of these experiments, although they were never realized, in the case of Italy, for example, in Ethiopia, they served as a blueprint for the experiments of Nazi colonization during the Second World War. So these are the Generalplan Ost, the plans that the Nazis had to conquer and colonize Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, were actually based on previous plans of colonization, of rural colonization in Africa. Even when these very ambitious plans did never come to fruition, in any case, the reorganization of the landscape to make it more productive for the colonial economy actually led to important changes. Farms where the plantation system worked were usually isolated, and they were controlling very vast territories. This one is in the island of Bioko. It was a plantation. As you can see, it's no longer one, so the rainforest, the jungle has regained the space. And in these isolated farms, you can find attempts again of the colonizers to feel at home. In this case, they are colonizers from the north of Spain, from the Basque Country, and what they did was to replicate not a sort of idealized Spanish vernacular architecture, but the very specific vernacular architecture of the Basque Country, which looks completely out of place in Central Africa. So one of the things is how it was possible for a very small group of white colonizers to control such vast expanses of colonized territory. And the thing is that they did it often through violence. So most of these farms were militarized, or they had military outposts nearby. That's the case, for example, with the German farms in German East Africa, in Namibia. There are also the company towns, especially around railway and transport hubs, mines, factories, and so on. These are the ruins of Elizabeth Bay, a mining company town in Namibia, where you have both the white population concentrated, a military presence, and local workers. And again, another good example of how the colonizers try to make themselves at home in these mining company town called Manskop, again in Namibia. You can see how the colonizers, which were Germans, used the Central European style of the period, the late 19th century, which again is totally out of place in these very edgy roofs are not very useful in the desert where never rains. Okay, so we have these militarized farms, we have outposts, company towns, and so on, but we still need some sort of materiality that helps the white colonizer to control these vast expanses of terrain. And there are several techniques, several material techniques and artifacts that help with that. And one of them is barbed wire. There is an excellent book by a French philosopher, Olivier Rassac, that is called The Political History of Barbed Wire. And he says that barbed wire is a very good example of the virtualization of power that is typical of modernity, which basically means that you need less and less materiality to have the same effect. So at the beginning, if you wanted to fence a large territory, you need a wall, a stone wall like the Hadrian's Wall or the Great Wall of China. With barbed wire, with much less material investment and with very few people, you can actually fence very large expanses of territory. And then, the last expression of this virtualization of power would be CCTVs, videos and satellites and so on. So for Olivier Rassac, there is this virtualization of power that starts in the late 19th century and comes to our days. But then we have also other weapons of control, like the machine gun, which is completely inseparable from the colonial experience. There cannot be a modern colonialism without the machine gun. And this is actually an archaeological find, because we were surveying an old colonial building in Ethiopia, that had been closed for a long time. When we were mapping the building, we found a door, we opened it, and we found this colonial arsenal with lots of guns and rifles and so on. And again, that's a very nice metaphor of what the Italian colonial power was about. These are Austrian machine guns from 1914, from the surplus from the First World War, that were used to control Ethiopia. So it's a metaphor of colonial power, but it's more than a metaphor, of course. It was an actual tool of control. There's also the railway. The fact that colonial powers could control vast territories very fast. It is because they had these new means of transportation. And one of the things in which colonial powers invested a lot during the first phase of the colonial period was in railways. So that's the case, for example, in the Sudan with Gordon's Railway. This was a military railway that was built only for a colonial campaign. And this has been studied archaeologically by archaeologists, and now the entire railway has been surveyed, and not just the railway, but all the camps and the military outposts and so on, all the infrastructure of colonialism around the railway. The infrastructures were, of course, something practical to control the territory, but they were something else. They were a sort of a spectacle, a sort of colonial spectacle. They were, again, a way of showing that colonial power was very progressive. And in my experience, it was very successful, because in Ethiopia, for example, a lot of people have a very good, or used to have a very good impression of the Italians, because they say, well, all the roads that we have were built by the Italians. They were very nice people. And they built bridges and tunnels and so on. You cannot see it because the photo is very bad, but in the entrance to the tunnel, there was the name of Mussolini. His cradle is still there today. So they were a very conscious way of making propaganda for the colony. And as I say, it was useful. But of course, they were not making roads and railways because they wanted to develop the countries. They were making that because they wanted to exploit the riches of these countries. And again, it's easy to see the connections between the roads and the mines and so on. So the colony did not just transform the landscape. In many ways, we can say that it destroyed the landscape, especially the case with open mining at a larger scale that you can see in many places, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in Botswana, in Congo, and so on. And this is actually the precedent of a continuous destruction. And the case of open mining and the destruction of the landscape for economic purposes is something that links the past and the present and reminds us that these archaeological traces are more than archaeological traces. This is an ongoing story, and the division between the past and the present is not so clear-cut in the case of colonialism. And finally, in relation to space, we have the frontiers, the colonial frontiers. And when I talk about colonial frontiers, I'm not referring only to talking about the area around the limits of the colonies, but also the internal frontiers, the frontiers of exploitation, the remote places, the isolated places where there were colonial outposts. And these colonial outposts are particularly important because they played an important role in shaping the colonial imagination, especially in the case of fascist colonialism, but not only. You find a similar thing in the case of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. So the idea is that you created a new man by putting this man in a very difficult place in the middle of nowhere and having to deal with the savages and the jungle and the lions and so on. So there was this epic idea of being able to resist in these very isolated frontier outposts. And it was actually very challenging. In the area where I work now in Somaliland, there is a memory of a British officer who was in command of a group of Somali colonial troops for like 10 years or so. And he said that in the group during the 2 decades, more or less in the 1940s and 1950s, there were 15 white colonial officers, and of these 15 colonial officers, 12 committed suicide. So it was actually very demanding and difficult. And we don't know that much about these colonial outposts because they were actually usually taken care of by one or two whites and a mass of African troops and servants. And there's not a lot of information about these places. So archaeology here can actually provide some interesting insights. We study the Italian outpost in Western Ethiopia. This is one of them. There's another one in Gambela. At the other place, we have the military outpost and we have the trading post, the trading outpost, which is like a peaceful site of the colony. And they were again very isolated in very remote places. There is a very good description of the life in these outposts in the Céline's novel, the Travel to the End of the Night, because he worked in one of these colonial factories in the south of Cameroon, I think. And he describes the loneliness and the horrible life actually of being isolated in one of these outposts in the middle of the forest. And of course, the other good description, although very fictionalized, is the Courts of the Heart of Darkness. But again, it's a good description not just of how life actually was, but about what was the role of the Europeans and how was the subjectivity that was being built in these isolated outposts. So this idea of this mixture of paranoia and the sense of superiority, of doing something heroic. Now, but what archaeology can do, we can locate these outposts because about many of them we have, again, very little information. And we can study the material culture of these outposts, how they were built, for example. These, again, come from Equatorial Guinea. Some of them were relatively luxurious. And they were produced in Germany, and they were shipped to Central Africa, and they were assembled there. So it was a sort of IKEA, of colonial IKEA. And this, again, it's very representative of the kind of technologies that were put at the service of colonialists. These kind of technologies were not that recent because the Dutch were already shipping forts to the colonies in the 17th century, and they were shipping the bricks and they were assembling the bricks in these outposts. But it's actually, if not super modern, it is definitely something modern. This idea that you can reconstruct your world everywhere by just shipping the materials. This is a map of one of these outposts that we did. And even in the smallest outposts, you can see a desire to reconstruct the hierarchies and the organization of colonial life. And again, the outpost of Gambela, you can see a very clear distinction between the space of the colonizers and the space of the colonized, with different architecture separated by a fence and a river and so on. As for the everyday life, the everyday life in the colonies was very much romanticized. People were sending photographs and postcards back home, depicting themselves like what they believed they were, and in a certain way they were, like a superior race, an elite, commanding over vast masses, large masses of Africans. You can see here that that's a wonderful representation of what colonial society was about, a group of white men in white dress. But as I was saying, referring to the colonial outposts, it was not that easy, right? Living in the colonies was actually, and in certain places could be actually quite difficult. One of the things that the colonizers tried to do, we saw it in the case of architecture, was to reconstruct their lives in the colonies. And this they did, among other things. We saw that they did it using manipulating or constructing a built space that was similar to the built space in the metropolis. The other thing they did was through food, for example. And we can document that in wares, the ceramics that we find in these places, but also in the tin cans, the preserved food they were sending to the colonies. And they were doing an enormous effort to ship tons and tons of canned European foods to these very remote places. And we found lots of tin cans in the sites, in the colonial sites that we study. And we also find lots of bottles, of alcoholic bottles. And this is another story that has been explored by some historians, but it could be explored more in depth, the relationship between alcoholism and colonialism. It's a very not epic, heroic story of colonialism. And there are two kinds of colonialism. There is the colonialism of the colonizers, the alcoholism of the colonizers, because it is, when you are in an outpost in the middle of the Central African jungle, the only thing that you can do is to get drunk, basically, and have sex with the natives. So it's basically what they were doing. But then there was also the alcoholism of the colonized. And this was a very conscious economic strategy of the colonial powers since from the 16th century onwards. They were selling large quantities of alcohol to the colonists, especially that's the case in all the area that was part of the slave trade in the 16th to the early 19th century. But then during the colonial periods, the attitudes differ. So in the French colonies, for example, the British colonies, there are attempts at curtailing the trade in alcoholic drinks because they see that it's a huge problem, that they are having problems with the local societies that are in disarray, with lots of problems, people not working and so on, especially people not working. That was a problem for the colonizers. But in other cases, they didn't do anything, and Spain is a good example of that. They were more interested in having all the natives drunk with cheap Spanish wine than actually having a more or less structured local society. And in the sites that we studied in Equatorial Guinea, we can see the change from German gin until the 1890 or something like that. And when Spain starts to effectively control the Guinean territory, all this gin is replaced by wine. And what is more interesting, you can see archaeologically how alcoholism actually starts in Equatorial Guinea. Because until the 1890s, you see alcohol, of course, you see gin bottles and so on in the archaeological sites, in the settlements, in the indigenous settlements. But it was like 40% of the materials that we document. The rest was pottery and perfume bottles and tools and things like that. When the Spanish come in earnest, so when they start colonizing Equatorial Guinea in earnest from 1885 onwards, you see that they bring lots and lots of bottles of wine and beer, and this makes up for like 90% or something like that of the assemblages. So the local people were basically buying alcoholic drinks. That was it. And this today it's still a huge problem in Equatorial Guinea. The rate of alcoholism is staggering. These are wine bottles and beer bottles from Italian outposts in Ethiopia. So this is the other side. This is the colonizers getting drunk to be able to survive in the colonies. And in this case, when we study these Italian colonial outposts, it was, again, 90% of the stuff that we found was basically alcoholic beverages. So again, a not very heroic fiction of colonialism. Archaeology can also help us study the creation of colonial consumers, not just of alcohol, but of other stuff as well. And there is actually a very interesting archaeological phenomenon, which is the appearance of a type of ware, the sponge ware, which appears in Africa in between 1890 and 1910, more or less. These are cheap wares that were produced in Northern Europe, in Scotland, and also in the Netherlands, in Maastricht in particular. There was a huge, and still there is a huge factory, a porcelain and ceramic factory there. And they were producing basically for the colonies. And you find exactly the same kind of stuff in West Africa, in South Africa, in East Africa, and in Southeast Asia. So in all the colonies, in all the European colonies from Africa to Southeast Asia. And now the interesting thing is that this kind of cheap pottery, you find it in the colonies, massively replacing local ceramics. But you also find it in peasant houses in Europe. So you can find it in Spain, in rural areas, and also in the Netherlands. And actually the original name of this pottery was Gaudy Dutch, like the happy Dutch. person, right? And this is interesting because it shows also what the colonizers were trying to do. They were trying to transform these autonomous indigenous societies in the colonies into an inferior peasant class. Like the same peasants that they have in Europe, they wanted to create the same kind of peasant class all over the world. And they did it also through material culture. At some point, they started producing pottery that had some designs geared towards the colonial public, the colonial consumers. And when we excavated in Somaliland, we excavated a British colonial time of the early 20th century. And we found lots of spongeware, but it was different to the spongeware, some of it, that we had dug in West Africa, even if in both cases it came from Maastricht. But the thing is that the spongeware from Somaliland had Islamic motifs, like stars and crescent moons and so on. So they were basically capturing the consumers for the different consumers. In many cases, colonialism actually meant the decline in the economic status and the lifestyle of the colonized, the impoverishment of large masses of population. This is something that was concealed. So the idea is that we are developing these people, we are helping them, they are improving their economies, but it was not in many cases. And you can see that through material culture and through archaeological sequences. And this again material from our excavations in Equatorial Guinea. And here we have a sequence from the late 19th century, from the late 18th century to the present. So we studied different dumps in abandoned settlements between the 1780s and the 1970s. And you can see this process of impoverishment of the colonial society very clearly. During the first half of the 19th century, these people were still important for the whites because they were local entrepreneurs and they were key actors in the slave trade, especially in a period when the slave trade had been forbidden by the British. And it was difficult. This was one of the last areas where you could still get slaves, like in south of the equator. So the indigenous were important, and they were participating in this Atlantic trade, and they were getting a lot of nice stuff, like transfer wares from Staffordshire, and good stuff that you could find in middle-class homes in the UK or in any other European country. But then, in the 1850s, the slave trade is finally and effectively forbidden in the area, and the locals are no longer useful for the Europeans. So they are expelled from the global economic networks, and the only things that they can get is cheap alcohol and cheap wares. So it is then when we see the arrival of these cheap sponge wares and the disappearance of anything that could be considered middle class in Europe. This is something that is even more obvious in the case of Somaliland. In Somaliland, we can study the entire sequence of imports from classical times, from the 1st century AD to the early 20th century, to the period of colonialism. And there is a huge cut, well, there are two cuts, but one of them is during the late antiquity period, so it doesn't have to do with modern colonialism. But the other huge cut is in the late 16th century. Before the late 16th century, in Somaliland, you have lots of stuff coming from everywhere, from the Mediterranean, from India, from China, from Southeast Asia. Amazing stuff like Chinese porcelain, very high quality. And then the Portuguese and the Dutch came into the Indian Ocean. They disrupt completely the trading networks of the Indian Ocean, and imports disappear from Somaliland until the late 19th century. And when the imports reappear in the late 19th century, it's just basically cheap European stuff. And this is another thing where archaeology can contribute, relatively nice stuff from East Asia, from China and Japan. So apart from the European trading networks, there were other actors participating in this colonial globalization that were not Europeans. About them, we know relatively little, and archaeology can provide some interesting information. And talking about non-Europeans participating in this global colonial world, we have the case of all the colonialists that are not that well known And one of them is the Turco-Egyptian colonialism, which started in the 1820s and came to an end just before the scramble for Africa in 1885. So the Europeans were not interested in having the Turco-Egyptians, that is the Ottomans from Egypt, participating in the division of and the sharing of Africa. And the British occupied Egypt in 1882, and the Turco-Egyptian Empire disappeared. But between 1821 and 1882, the Turco-Egyptian Empire was a huge empire in Africa. It occupied from the Mediterranean coast to Uganda and the Congo, and from South Sudan to the Red Sea. So it was a huge empire and a precedent for the European empires in the area. And the materiality of it is extremely interesting, and from an archaeological point of view, quite eloquent. So there is a completely different kind of materiality for Turco-Egyptian colonialists, depending on whether you see the Red Sea or the interior parts of the Turco-Egyptian Empire, that is Sudan and Uganda, Congo, and so on. And this has to do with the Islamic worldview. So the Red Sea was Dar al-Islam. It was a country with Islamic rulers, Islamic subjects, and so on. And it was also a place with a very long history of cities from the early Middle Ages. So here the Turco-Egyptian Empire took a very monumental form. You have very beautiful buildings with arcades, commercial buildings, houses, and they actually try to reproduce, as the Europeans did in other areas, the local style. In the Red Sea, there is a thing called the Red Sea style, which developed between the 16th and the early 19th century. And what the Egyptians did was to replicate this style in their cities. Berbera is an amazing example of this Red Sea style, this reinvented Red Sea style, this recreation of the Red Sea style. And it's extremely interesting because the style of the houses, it's very traditional. It's like the vernacular architecture of the Red Sea. But the plan itself of the city has nothing to do with the local cities. It's completely rectilinear. It's a very modern, very colonial type of urbanism. There are some forts also to control the territory, and these forts are European style, so it's the same kind of forts that you can find in Algeria, for example, the kind of forts that the French were building in their own colonies. But now if you look at the other side, if you look at the Sudan and the South Sudan and so on, you don't find any monuments, you don't have any impressive structure, and this is because there was Dar al-Harb, the territory of war, the territory of the pagans that could be enslaved, that could be killed, against which you could, or against whom you could wage war. So basically what we have is forts that are not very monumental. It's just very low walls made with masonry, and they were practical devices, basically to crowd huge masses of people, of slaves that they were taking to ship them farther north to Egypt to be sold in Cairo. A very different case is that of the Greeks in East Africa. The Greeks have been in East Africa at least since the 1st century AD, and actually during our recent surveys in Somaliland, we found a couple of Greek graffiti of the 1st century AD, so they have been around for a long while. But during the late 19th century, there was a Greek diaspora that migrated to Sudan and Ethiopia and Eritrea, but especially Ethiopia. And it's not properly speaking colonialist because it was done in accordance with the local authorities, with the Ethiopian government, and it was not racist. And this is quite amazing. So the Greeks mixed with the Ethiopians, and they bred hybrid families that were completely integrated in the local society. We studied one of these great settlements, the Middle in West Ethiopia, which is still preserved when we studied it. The beautiful architecture that they built there. And it's not Ethiopian architecture and it's not Greek architecture either. It's some sort of colonialist African architecture with verandas and so on. And we still found a lot of people that most of the Greeks have left, but their families are still there. I mean, so I remember that talking with Ethiopians that were called Dionysos and Ponimios and things like that. Most of them could not speak Greek anymore. They felt Ethiopians, and actually during the Italian invasion in 1935, the Greeks took to the mountains as partisans to fight against the Italians with the Ethiopians. So it's a very unique case of European presence in Africa that clearly goes against the trends of European colonialism. And I will finish very fast with colonial violence, a specific example of colonial violence. This is the ugly side of colonization, and something that we have to remember because the colonial fantasy has been so strong, the colonial fictions, that many people still have romanticized a positive idea of what colonization was and was about. And not just ordinary people, but also politicians, that in their discourses and in their policies, they try to vindicate, reclaim the relevance of colonialism and the civilizing mission and so on. But the truth is that colonialism was basically violence, and actually it was in Africa where some of the first genocides were conscious, planned genocides took place, like the one of the Germans against the Herero people, as you can see here in the photograph, that condemned tens of thousands to starvation and death. Yeah. This is from the colonial army depot in Ethiopia, with lots of rifles from the colonial period. The oldest ones are from the late 19th century, from the time the Ethiopians came first to East Africa. And again, it's a good representation of what colonialism is about. The colonies were a space for punishing, and it is not that concentration camps were built there to lodge the colonizers, the colonized, but also the colonizers. So in some places, concentration camps were established for the people living in Europe. I mean, the most famous case, of course, is Australia, who was a penitentiary colony. But during the 20th century, these penitentiary colonies, in the case of Africa, were not for common prisoners, but for political prisoners, usually for leftists. That's the concentration camp the ruins of the concentration camp of Tarrafal in Cape Verde, that was established by the Portuguese in 1936. It's a precedent of the concentration camps that were being established at that point in Europe. But the colony was, of course, also not just a space for punishment, but a punished space where most of the violence that we see in the Second World War, in the Balkan Wars, or in later wars, was already experienced, the mass violence against civilians. And this is my last case study. It's a case study of violence against the Ethiopian partisans, against anti-colonial resistance. This is the massacre of Seven that took place in April 1931, and according to Italian sources, it took the lives of about 800 resistance fighters. The story that we found was quite different from that recorded in the Italian papers. So the Italian papers themselves were secret. They were discovered by an Italian historian in 2006, I think. So he discovered about an operation to quench the Ethiopian rebellion next to the capital, next to Addis Ababa, by one important resistance leader, Bebe Aregai. So he was putting in serious problems the Italian occupation authorities. So they decided to launch a huge campaign to quench this rebellion, and they were quite successful. So they managed to surround the main group of these resistance fighters in this cave, and they, according to the documents, killed 800 of them. About the operation itself, of how they surrounded the cave and killed the people, there were just a few documents that, as I say, were secret and were discovered by this Italian historian. Before that, this operation was unknown. I mean, historians knew that there had been an operation, but they didn't know much about the details. So it seemed like they were just, fighting against partisans. So following the article of this Italian historian, we found the place of the massacre of the cave. And the cave has been left as it was since 1939, so everything was in situ. So we were able to map the entire cave, at least the area of the cave that was closer to the outside. We mapped the different activity areas. We found lots of granaries where people were storing the grain. We found areas of food processing areas with grinding stones and pottery and so on. We found clothes, and we found corpses. We found the corpses of, I think, around 18 people, and most of these 18 people, they were either very old people, women, or babies, children below the age of 2. So according to the Italian documents, those that the Italians killed were just resistance fighters, 800 resistance fighters, and they also found 25 women and children that they sent to all the villages, and that was it. So based on the archaeological evidence, we know that this was obviously wrong. It was false. So there were probably more than 800 people based on the amount of granaries and stuff that we found. We think that it's probably closer to 1,000 than 800. And of these 1,000 people, probably around 75% were women, children, elderly people, non-combatants. And this is based on the stuff that we found. It's basically everyday stuff, pottery, grinding stones, winnowing baskets, and so on. This is only used by women in Ethiopia. So it's not male stuff, it's just women. And then the traditional Ethiopian armies were like 70% were non-combatants, were the families of the warriors. So the armies were moving around the country with the entire families. The soldiers were taking their entire families. And the soldiers depended on their families, because it was the women and the children that were fetching water and fuel and making clothes and so on. And we have found all of these activities in this cave. We also found cotton being prepared to make clothes and so on. So it was basically a massacre of civilians, because we also know that a group of resistance fighters, because the Italians tell it in the documents, managed to escape the cave. So they basically killed maybe 600, 700 unarmed civilians. And they didn't talk about that even in the secret documents about the operation. What they did talk about is about how they managed to overwhelm the Ethiopians. So as you could see in the other image, it's not easy to storm this cave because it's very abrupt. It's very small slit to get into the cave. So they basically rappel down the cliff, and they drop bombs with mustard gas, which was, of course, prohibited at that time. You could not use mustard gas in a war. It was illegal, and least of all against civilians, as it was this case. And we found evidence of this in the shape of the safety ring of a 2 kilos bomb, Italian bomb. So this aluminium thing was, you had to pull this thing to drop the bomb. So this is a good example of how archaeology can actually tell another story that contradicts the official documents. So just to finish, so archaeology, at the end of the day, can actually deconstruct through material culture the ideologies, the fantasies, and the phantoms, the ghosts of the colonial enterprise. The ideologies are these discourses about the civilizing mission, about the progressive and modernizing ideals of the colony. The fantasies have to do with these heroic ideals of male fighters in the middle of the jungle, resisting waves and waves of attacks of natives and lions and monkeys and so on. And the ghosts are the traumas, the unhealed traumas of the colonial occupation that have been buried, but that reappear as ghosts in the present. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation the second year on this now it's still some at one for think the different house to analyze and rounds of the directed to the last revolution the good but it's weird to never killing that chill up to the big moment between the witness comments and the other blind that it was so much I want to push up for this show that shouldn't want to some good shows so let's step up with the game